It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Sherri Killins Stewart. We're so pleased to have her today. Dr. Killins Stewart is the Director of State Systems Alignment and Integration for the BUILD Initiative, where she works directly with state leaders to advance early childhood systems efforts in health, in early learning, and in family support, with a focus on defining and creating intentional practices regarding equity. She also co-leads a network of early childhood leaders to advance racial equity. She also is an independent consultant whose clients have included the New Haven Public School System, Stone Foundation, the Kellogg Foundation, the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, Pearson Publishing, and others. Dr. Killins Stewart was the former Commissioner of Early Care and Education, or Early Education and Care for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Formerly Vice President of Human Development and Operations at the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and led 2 empowerment zones in 2 cities, New Haven and Baltimore. Today, Dr. Killins Stewart will present the findings of her forthcoming report on the experiences of Black leaders with philanthropy in the early childhood field, which was commissioned by the Early Childhood Funders Collaborative. Dr. Killins Stewart, welcome. Thank you for being here. I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Karen. And thank you, Sharon, at the Early Childhood Funders Collaborative, and Rena and Vance for creating this opportunity. This is critical work, but those of you who know me know it's about taking action. And so as listed in your values, we want to lean into the lived experience of Black leaders and begin to understand how that may shift our own policy, practice, and programs. I can't do this without thanking the Early Childhood Funders Collaborative for living their mission and values and being willing to listen to these voices, and certainly the Black leaders and leaders serving Black children and families in the workforce who agreed to share their experiences and thoughts. I was also helped in this project by Isha Ray, formerly at the Erickson Institute, and Penny Smith, who's currently at Erickson, in creating the interview protocol and some of the interviews. Our goals today are to share with you the thoughts and ideas from selected Black leaders who are really working directly with Black children, their families, and communities, to help you to understand from their perspective the barriers to opportunities expressed by them in managing their organizations, and really hope that you would find opportunities to really shift your practices to increase investment for Black leaders and organizations. And we don't have to look far to find data that shows that this is a challenge. If you take the first article, Black Funding Denied, Community Foundation Support, it shows that 1% of the grant making from 25 foundations that were looked at in that article go to Black communities, while 15% of those communities are actually Black individuals. And to show that another way, $78 per person in the community foundations area serves white individuals, but only $6 serves Black communities. And there's plenty of other articles, and I'll share more as we go forward, and clearly not calling out community foundations, but just offering you an example of the opportunity. But let's do our first poll and see how you and your organizations are thinking about, your organizations either thinking about or have taken action to intentionally fund Black leaders, organizations, and communities. Let's take a minute and see. And thank you for taking the poll, get a sense of who's in the room and what we're thinking. 10 more seconds. Okay, Karen, share the results. So about 63% of you are taking action, and 33% are thinking about it, and 4% not sure. And all of those are the right answers, the honest answers from where you sit. And we hope today's conversation will help you see ways that you can contribute and lean in. So we invited 39 individuals and interviewed 21. across multiple states, 10 states and 6 national organizations. They primarily were in the early childhood space, although some in maternal child, some did early childhood and family, a couple from K to 12, and one's specifically focused on workforce because of who the work was being done for. And when we talk to the leaders, we talk to them about these 4 big buckets. You know, what is your organization structure and what supports you as a Black leader, partnerships and structures. Tell us about your investment experience, but for your programs and services. Talk to us about your leadership, your challenges in retaining and promoting Black leadership. And then finally, we asked them, if you had a message for funders, what would you recommend, especially those who haven't traditionally intentionally funded Black organizations? So that's where we started in this broad base brief interview. And from that, I have 4 recommendations. And I'm telling you at the beginning, because as we go through, I will offer you quotes and ideas from the actual leaders themselves, but I want you to be grounded in where we're going. And so one is think about intentions versus impact. To really think about, are the grants you're given really funding and benefiting Black children and families? Because often the data about Black children and families is used, but the benefit, the outcome, the pathway does not necessarily lead there, especially in partnerships. And you'll hear more about that. Look at your own past and current connections with Black leaders and organizations. They're going to talk to you in these quotes about the funding amounts being reduced, multiple requests for information, just straight denials. And I think if we look in our own portfolios, as someone who worked in a foundation, we can find our own examples and be curious about those situations. Networks are important. Intentionally build and expand your network. There's information about lived experience I'll share, but really intentionally build a relationship over time with Black leaders, communities, and organizations. And finally, support the capacity of organizations. So much funding goes to programming that the ability of Black organizations to build that back office for accounting and research and data and administration, marketing, and even grant writing is challenged. And those are the exact things we look for when we're trying to decide sometimes the worthiness of funding a leader. So there are 5 themes that I'm going to offer around infrastructure, around race, relationships, strategies, leadership, and investment. On infrastructure, there are 3: mismatched vision, networks, and isolated and limited representation. In reference to mismatched vision, the vision of leaders, which is designed to really remediate problems and create opportunity in the Black community, is often not seen as aligned with the solutions the funder seeks to fund. So Black leaders talk about swimming upstream towards someone else's vision. Brilliant Black people can't further their vision and purpose because they're locked out of funders and their dreams are dying on the vine. These are quotes from conversations that we had with leaders. Fund us to do what we do well, not your dream. This is the way community gets to scale. Networks. Black leaders talked about having few formal networks. Leaders spoke of intentionally creating safe spaces for leaders to support their own professional growth and the work. It's just a lot of spaces that Black leaders think they aren't a part of. Here's a quote I enjoy: "We don't have networks often sitting on millions of dollars. Our networks are broke nonprofits, grassroots, civil rights organization. Everybody's broke chasing the same dollar." Isolation and limited representation. Black leaders sought to include other leaders in their work and really expand the tables. There was a story told by one of the people we interviewed that said, you know, I mentioned someone's name, happened to be a Black woman. Everybody said, I don't know who she is. And he intentionally brought her in front of the funders, let her do a presentation about her and her work. And then as a result of that, she built a relationship with the foundations and they began to fund her going forward. So Black leaders say we really just shape the dialogue in a different way. There's not necessarily networks that are statewide for Black leaders. The next category was around relationships. And here we talked about connections and allies, lived experience, and competition. Um, Funders are not naturally in the network of Black leaders. Therefore, it's really helpful if a funder vouches or creates a pathway to funding for others. So there are quotes about how funders can be a broker to bring other Black leaders into the network, and how relationships lead to preferred access and therefore preferred funding, and how if you're a Black leader and you're not in those spaces, then you don't often have the opportunity for the money. That the foundation is not where the relationship sits, it actually sits with the people. And so how do we support Black leaders to have relationships with multiple people inside of a foundation? They talked about connection to allies and strategic relationships, and how some really feel they need a white person to vouch for you to get the money. Often Black leaders need a white person to get validation, and that creates frustration for them. We need networks because often Black leaders can't be the face of the request. Lived experience. Here, leaders had a lot to say about how some funders and foundations don't understand it from the point of the view of the community, and that often leads to miscommunication. This is a quote, "I just don't think funders have the lived experience in the area. They don't know what I know," or they may have limited contact with funders, with communities of color. On competition, they feel like often they're set up against Black-led and non-Black-led organizations, and sometimes they're even set up against each other. And then regarding strategies, there was conversation about valuing Black families and competing visions of complex needs. So here, the focus on all children may prevent foundations from investing in efforts which intentionally tailor to Black children and their families. Community-based efforts which are tailored to Black children often are inclusive of the whole family. Leaders talked about how Black men are often not seen as part of the family. Remembering this is coming from the early childhood perspective, and that often people are denied the opportunity to gain funding even without even asking a question. They just say, no, we don't fund things around Black men. And while Black children are often at the bottom of the measures, the funding ends up going to all children versus intentionally tailoring to make sure first we're meeting the needs of Black children, and then other children will benefit as well. There was also this idea of competing visions of the complex needs of Black communities. Leaders talked about there being a tension in seeing the complexity of institutional structural problems, and then funders and foundations wanting to treat a simple system, a simple symptom. We see the barriers are not just one lever or one dial. They talked a lot about the complexity and how they really work hard to break it down into something simple so that they can get funding, but that ignoring the complexity leads to institutional and structural problems and barriers. We asked them about their own leadership and the leadership of others. They talked about there being talented Black leadership, about not being heard, about Black women and Black men, about how funding creates the experts, about boards, and about staffing. So there are many professionals that are talented in organization. They talked about how they're often beloved for their brilliance and their strategies, but nobody's pouring in, nobody's investing in those leaders. They don't get promotions or senior titles. They often in their grants don't have enough to then pour into professional development. More than one story about being the first Black leader of an organization that primarily served Black children, and sometimes a struggle even in attaining that position. How some nonprofits, because of their financial structure, are able to pay better. So even when you get a strong Black leader, they end up buried in another organization versus being able to work for a Black-led organization. And finally, that they really work hard to have intentional processes to hire Black and brown populations from universities or for research, but that it's an extra step and you really have to be diligent in doing that recruitment. There was conversation about not being heard, that there's still often only one Black woman in the space, that issues around pay equity, often the lowest paid with the highest demand, and that sometimes folks feel like they're just giving lip service, that people say, okay, and then move on to do the idea they already had. There was a conversation about just being Black men and women and the constant anxiety of being a Black woman or man, and that they're always worried about managing the negative perceptions or the bias that others may have against them. This quote, "I'm always aware I'm a Black person because I won't get the benefit of the doubt." So you constantly feel pressured. Funding creates experts, that funders don't realize that funding creates experts and it builds trust. And the lack of funding really makes the work invisible. And that resources make you influential, but it doesn't necessarily make you a subject matter expert. And so we really want to trust the community as experts, their sense of what communities do. They feel like there's some sense that individuals feel that there's a waste when the money is put in the community. So to do more intentional listening to grantees, because there's always two sides to every story, at least two sides. We talked about boards and how having a diverse board may actually decrease funding opportunities, because white women seem to get funding with no problem. If you go to diversify the board, you may reduce your access to funding. And that funders are always thinking, you know, is the board diverse? But how are they making sure that that diversity is leading to inclusion of new idea and impacting decision making? On staffing, almost to a person, all the leaders, of course, as we do, work more hours than the funds actually pay for. Many work long periods of time being understaffed or unpaid or growing their organization. This quote, "I work free till July." She had another job, and so she would write grants and get programming, and then she would pour the money into the organization. Or someone else who said, "I work on paper 1 week a month." I actually worked through a third-party administrator because they didn't trust her organization to be able to do the work. Or somebody who said, I don't want to leave, but I'm doing 5 jobs. And at some point, it becomes a hustle. Investment is the next category. And here we talked about capacity, small organizations, partnership, and flexibility. On capacity, most Black leaders work in organizations that are under-resourced and struggle with capacity to shift from programming to grant writing. Organizations often have a long history, but they hear they can't manage a large grant. And if they're never given a large grant, they won't be able to manage it. I can't demonstrate that they can manage a large grant. And that folks talk about it being a battle just to get $5,000, and that often the scope of work doesn't shift, even though the amount of money is reduced. So even when grants are awarded, they feel like the funder is often suspicious, especially of small community-based organizations, and often will put money into somebody to oversee the grant versus building the capacity of the organization. That there are many small Black-led organizations, and that one of the challenges is that they're not getting enough support around capacity building, and that our requirements for grants and applications look the same for small organizations as they do for large organizations. And one person actually told the story of, I still have a tear in my eye trying to put together all the data that was required to complete a grant application. There was a bright spot when one individual told a story that a funder gave them 2 financial advisors, and how that turned the corner for their organization. And so support sustainability of organizations for larger community outcomes. On investment, people talked about being exploited a lot since Black Lives Matter, because people want a partner who can say that they serve Black children, but they may get slighted when the funding comes along, and how they feel like there's very little room for failure because you're always applying for funding moving forward. On partnerships, they're seen as an opportunity and a risk because it's hard to find a partner that they want to use your data, they want to use your name, but they may not contribute to you fairly. You get slighted when the funding comes, but a partner is an opportunity to stretch. They talked about the flexibility that they've seen during COVID, and they really wish there was more space for flexibility and, of course, more unrestricted funding. They said, look, we will do the program, but we need the unrestricted funding to really build our capacity and support our organizations. So here, before we go we through this section of their message to you, I want to do one more poll, do another poll. Karen? Let's see. So as I went through that, did it surprise you? Did it expand your current understanding? Did it confirm what you already knew? Okay, about 10 more seconds. I think we're good. Okay, Karen. Okay, so, 4% surprise, 64% expanded your current understandings, and then 32% confirmed the insights and you were familiar. So our last question to the leaders was, what's your message? You get to talk directly to funders. What would you say? And they said a few things. They said, one, create a safe space for holding others accountable for creating spaces for Black leadership. Fund what we do well versus what funders think is a tailored solution. Invest in people, how you recruit, retain, and support Black leadership, and actually look for organizations led by people of color. Fund their development, and that really takes 3 years. That's not a 1-year grant because you have to be able to do the work and invest in their development and leadership. Interrogate your own boards and staffs around the number of people with lived experience. And think about whole family, whole community. Really think about what it means to work with community and get to know those communities. Don't separate Black children from their families and communities, and know that it's, if you want to invest in this, it's not a one and done deal. We're really fighting against a huge set of social determinants of health. They also said fund their operating, that they would do program, but you got to fund their general operating. Find ways to really help and lean in the smaller organization. Many of them are. Be flexible at failing forward, be a learning partner. Monitor the inclusion of Black organizations and majority white grants to make sure there is a shared benefit. Think about multi-year. And have a question. If you have a question about equity, make sure it's a verb, make sure it's clear the community, the population, who's really going to benefit from doing that work. So I will go through just my recommendations again, and then offer a couple of other articles that triangle these ideas. But intention versus impact is important. If you're funding organizations that express a commitment to Black children and families, have the organizations be more specific about how they measure success and who's the specific community and what barriers or challenges are they really trying to address. And look at the partnerships between Black-led organizations to make sure that the Black-led organization is truly a partner. Consider your own past practices. Audit the grants you had with Black leaders and determine if there are patterns that can be remediated because they cause exclusion. Look at those initial grant amounts and see how much was actually approved. Think about your own networks and create opportunities for leaders to present their program to you, your foundation, and other leaders in the foundation, but also others. And funders who are interested in removing barriers should really intentionally seek to build relationships over time with those leaders. And we know that's both a personal and interpersonal investment. And recognize the need that Black founded and Black led organizations need to really build their capacity. And that's not about leadership only of the leaders. It's more about the capacity of the organization to do some of the primary functions we see in larger, well-established organizations. And figure out this lived experience thing. Get to know the leaders, get to know the issues they're challenged with. We know that funding comes on a cycle, and so make space for this in your everyday work. Increase the diversification of staff of color, but don't just include them. Make sure that we're listening to them and they're impacting the grant giving. And think about a specific population or area of Black community within your funding scope and understand the historical and institutional challenges in those environments and for their residents. So this is an article. There's other research. ECFC funded this to really think about early childhood, but there are other places that have done other work which validates and affirms the work that we were able to do. This comes as an article, Philanthropy and Racial Funding Gap, and they have similar recommendations. Get connected, build rapport, secure organizational support, sustain relationship with Black leaders. And they talk about Black-led organizations being 76% smaller than white organizations, or 91% smaller in terms of unrestricted dollars. So there's evidence that this is an important area, even in highly qualified organizations, which is what that organization spoke to. And then there's the Association of Black Foundation Executives, who's of course looked at this issue. And they talk about building agency, pushing for structural change, really taking a long view, encouraging shared responsibility within the foundation for philanthropic and public dollars. It's an issue in both spaces, working with your trustees so that they take stock, engaging Black businesses, which is another way to contribute. Excuse me, and then understanding the diaspora. I talk about Black and African American, but there are many individuals from different walks. So one last poll, and then we're going to go off to the breakout. But, you know, I will act on the following recommendation in the next 60 days. So it's multiple choice. In thinking about what you heard or maybe what you're already doing, is there a recommendation that I've offered that you might take on in the next 60 days? Okay, 5 more seconds, and then Karen, we can see what we got. Okay, great, thank you. So 65% really expand your network to include more Black leaders and leverage connections to benefit Black communities. 39% supporting the capacity of a Black-led organization. 52% deepening your understanding of the work. Clearly, all of us taking steps forward is what's going to be critical for moving this agenda forward. So I'm going to stop sharing that, and then Karen, put up the slide. We're going to give you an opportunity to go into a room and talk with 3 of your colleagues about this work, and introduce yourself first so that you get to know each other. But thinking about either the response to the survey or anything I've said, you know, what's your opportunity and what's the challenge that really stands in your way? We really encourage you to be in dialogue, because this work requires growth in us personally, getting to know each other so that we can make the institutional changes we seek to have.